Oh, well, hi, David. Lovely to
Oh.
see you there on Zoom on the other side of the world. I'm wondering, David, if you could talk a bit about, I'm thinking about the folks who might be taking up the invitation of this course, and I'm imagining that a lot of those folks are going to be cisgender narrative practitioners, and I'm wondering what you would have to say to them, because I'm thinking about myself as a queer practitioner and the times that I get tired of being the only one doing the work, and how much I really want, and really value co-conspirators like yourself taking up the invitation to do this work, that, everyone's stepping into spaces of queering their practice, but that a lot of cis practitioners that I come across feel nervous and reluctant to do that for lots of different reasons. What would you share with cisgender practitioners about your own experience of stepping into those spaces, and what kind of advice would you give them based on your experience of really navigating complexity and sitting in discomfort?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think that stepping into those spaces that I'm privileged to work with, I think one thing that it does is that really allows you to critically examine your own gender identity and sexuality, and not to take that, a lot of self-reflexivity, that you can not only be more collaborative and effective with trans folks and queer folks that you work with, but also, probably more importantly, not at the expense of trans and queer folks, but alongside, like to make you a more accountable person in your own relationships, in who you interact with, like with like clients who are straight or cis or white. Like, so these ideas of querying of the practice is helpful, not just for the other, but just it's an ethic of how you approach the work. And so in a sense, the work ends up becoming more of an ethic of critiquing and subverting normativity in all of its forms, not just gender and sexuality, to live richer lives and more accountable lives that are informed also by a social justice ethic. So that there is a lot of uncomfortability and not being able to, kind of take for granted that ground, that firm ground that cis folks experience, along with like white and all the other dominant categories. So that sort of not having that firm ground, if you sit with it and stay more in that position of not knowing, curiosity, feeling uncomfortable, listening, speaking, noticing your defensive reactions and just noticing that, not responding to it. Those defensive or uncomfortable responses is where I think learning happens. And I think also what it does is that, yeah, like for me, it's like changed the way I experience my own gender and my own desire, and noticing other kinds of desires, or like standing up against oppressive normative practices. And I find that with the folks I supervise who are cis from the dominant culture, they start to rethink their own lived experiences, their own identities that they took for granted.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that. And I know this is a really personal question, and of course I should say that it's a personal question. If you're asking everyone, obviously people often feel entitled to interrogate trans folks about their gender, but I was interested in whether you'd be up for sharing a bit more about what the journey of reflecting on your own relationship with your own gender has been, where that's taken you, what's been surprising about that, if you feel comfortable sharing about that.
Sure. I think that's an important question, because I can give you the reference after our talk. It's a YouTube clip where Janet Mock, who's a African-American trans woman, they do a reversal where she interviews a cis person, like a media figure, about when did you know you were cis? Like the sort of questions that are like that voyeuristic curiosity or trans as the object of curiosity, that's disrespectful, even if it's well-intended. Like cis folks aren't asked those questions. So I think it is important to, I think so I always consider myself as like contesting, dominant forms of masculinity. But it was a little too celebratory, like, wow, I have designer shoes and I have a man bag. Look at me, I'm really, contesting it in these more superficial ways. Not that they're insignificant, but, or look how understanding I am as a man. Look at, I've read feminist literature. It again recenters the masculinity at the, kind of, and so I started to really think a lot more deeply about how, as much as I was trying to contest dominant forms of masculinity, I still was reproducing them. And so that was part of the journey that was difficult, but also, I think, helped me to show up differently in relationships and not reproduce as much some of those dominant discourses. Judith Butler, a queer scholar, talks about like this matrix of normativity. There's like, you're assigned a sex at birth. Usually it's a fixed sex based on your genitalia, male or female. It's a binary. Then that establishes your gender identity, which is your sense of yourself. Again, a binary. That then shapes your gender expression, and then your sexual attraction of the quote opposite sex. So even though I was contesting some of those categories, I was still reproducing them. And so when I started to contest that, then I noticed like maybe the ways that I might express my gender might not match up with how I identify as a man, or people that I was in relationship with. I noticed that I found new desires or new attractions to folks based on identities that were not of the dominant culture. And I began to see like desire is much more fluid than so it helped me to kind of move away from essentialism in terms of like a fixed identity, that it's not just identity, but it's a practice, and it's like the directionality of a person's desire or gender expression is in movement. So that's been helpful for me.
It would be really great to hear you talk a bit about trans theory and how that's coming to your work and how it fits alongside queer theory, for example.
Sure. They're definitely connected to each other. But also like Susan Stryker, a trans woman who's done a lot of work on the, looking at the history of trans folks throughout time. And she talks about like queer theory is trans theory's evil twin. So like I was introduced to queer theory, and I consider myself a queer theorist and a queering narrative therapy. And, some of the kind of core assumptions of queer theory, it's really hard to reduce queer theory to a set of core assumptions that it's like unqueering it, but just for a working framework, that what we consider to be natural is actually constructed, like gender is a social construction. And queer theory affords a vocabulary for critiquing the gender binary. And it also affords like an ability to like contest normativity in general, right? But I think one of the things that has been potentially problematic is, for instance, queer theory, the voices of queer theory were not trans folks. And queer theory can focus so much on the construction of gender and sexuality, and not really, there's not enough examination and vocabularies around the materiality of the body. So that trans theory is providing, which was developed by trans folks themselves, like we're connected to queer theory and feminist theory, but there's also this our experiences of our body that get erased in queer theory when everything's just a construction. And so like, if you look at like queer theory from like in certain forms, like, oh, it's a critique of the binary. If gender is constructed, then why would you want to transition? Aren't you just replicating the binary? Does that make sense? So trans theory is just providing this new set of ideas of not erasing the body, but not reducing things to the body. So there's this interesting tension between the two that I think leads to a more rich account of everybody, including trans folks. I think narrative therapy sometimes has not paid enough attention to the body. I haven't really thought about it much more than just saying that, but does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's probably a big question, but can you give much of a sense of what that looks like in terms of a practice or a micro practice even?
Yeah, I mean, I think in asking narrative questions, I might ask now more fully, like, like the alternative story, like not only language, are you feeling that in your body somewhere? Might be something I might pay attention to. As relates to working with trans communities, I think trans theory, along with queer theory, allow us to have conversations about, let's say, if I'm working with a trans woman who wants to move forward with surgery, let's say female breast reconstruction or breast augmentation, from one lens, wow, isn't this reproducing like normative ideas of women's bodies, the breast being important? But from a trans theory perspective, you can have conversations about why that's important to them without reducing it to an essentialist notion of the body. So it's kind of hard to put it into words. Maybe there's other language that's better at than English, but like we can't ignore the body, because like people I work with often want to move forward with some like hormones or surgery. How can we do it in a way that is not biologically reductionistic? And I think trans theory creates some set of framework to have that conversation where it's not an either or.
That sounds just so important and has me reflecting really differently on my work and the ways in which I think I would choose to do that. But I've never been able to language it before. I've just kind of made friends with an unresolvable grey space in the middle, which doesn't question people's lived experiences of their own bodies, but also complicates these gender constructions that we live in. But also, we don't know what it would be like if we lived in a world where those constructions didn't exist. What trans folks' experiences would be. That's impossible to know, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a interesting question, but it is a theoretical question, and it's hard. We might not arrive there, but I think given our set of circumstances and where we're situated, I think trans theory with queer theory, I think each depends on the other, helps to have more nuanced conversations about people's experience of their own gender, including parts of their gender and sexuality that's connected to their body. So like in the DSM, there's like, so if somebody I'm seeing wants to move forward with surgery, there still is some gatekeeping practices where I have to officially diagnose the person as gender dysphoria, which I have a problem with. Things are shifting. Eventually, it's not going to be seen as a psychiatric diagnosis, but I still have to use that diagnosis as a strategy for people to move forward with medical transition. So I think what trans theory does is it like comes up with new ways of thinking about one's experience of their body without reducing to a psychiatric description. So like a less of a medicalized description, because gender dysphoria was not a term that was coined by the community itself. Like a lot of identities, homosexuality, for instance, were not invented, created by the community themselves. They were imposed by experts, doctors, psychiatrists, legal folks, religion. So I think trans theory allows, like, how can we acknowledge the body and talk about it without it being reduced to sort of just a reductionistic medical way of thinking about it? There's a lot to it, and it's something that I'm still learning a lot. But I think sometimes I've talked to queer scholars who are in privileged academic positions, like, if gender is constructed, why would you want to move forward with medical transition? Aren't you just reproducing the binary that you're trying to contest? And I think that's I think that misses the boat a bit, or a lot.
It has me thinking about Esben Esther's work, talking about finding, making our bodies finding a good resting place in our bodies. But it also has me thinking about the importance of, like, if you're being a co-conspirator with someone in a moment when they're seeking medical transition, doing that in a way that's incredibly affirming of that choice, but not limiting of possibilities in the future. If folks later discover new gendered possibilities or ways of being, or want to think about that experience differently, that's all possible.
That's
too.
a really important point that you said there. So a couple things. One is it goes back to co-conspirator, like, again, how allies really profit. So, like, for instance, trans folks, at least in the United States, if they want to start hormone therapy or surgery, they need to see a mental health professional. Things are shifting, but is moving more towards an informed consent model. But often the insurance or the surgeon wants a letter from a mental health professional to confirm they have gender dysphoria. But what ends up happening is mental health professionals, mainly cisgender, they profit from that, because they're required to go through the mental health professional, and the mental health professional will charge an exorbitant amount of money and need to assess them. So it repositions the cis person. And so, like, one thing that I'm a part of is called the Gender Affirming Letter Access Project, where you make a pledge to see folks and write clearance letters on a pro bono basis. So you're not charged for it. So that's a movement I'm part of. So I probably see about 5 folks a week for free. And they're so appreciative, because they've been seeing other mental health professionals who ask all these, like, very, impositional questions and voyeuristic questions and medicalized questions. And it's, like, super expensive, or they can't find a trans affirming therapist in the whole town they're in. And then I see them in maybe a half hour, they have the letter. So that's definitely important, as to how can we not profit from the work? Because, like, cis folks don't have to go to a mental health professional to move forward with any, medical procedure, right? I think the other thing that
breast augmentation, for example.
Exactly. The other thing that's really important, as much as, like, trans theory is really trying to theorize the body in non-reductionistic ways, there's a danger to reproduce normativity. So there's a lot of recent scholarship on trans normativity. Like, for instance, like, only certain trans bodies are made legitimate if they do the transition in that normative way. Hormones, surgery, change your legal name, binary pronoun, like that normative trans experience. And also, if you add white or middle class, upper middle class Christian, those trans folks have more privileges than folks whose gender identities or contesting the binary, deciding to not express their trans identity through medical transition, but other ways, like through social transition. And so that's something, so it's complex, this work. It's like queer theory, feminist theory, trans theory, also critiquing not only cis normativity and homonormativity and heteronormative, but there's also transnormativity that makes certain bodies, trans bodies, more normative and legitimate than others. And you'll see that with like a discourse of M to F or F to M, right? So like as opposed to like a trans woman, like these sort of, I think the other thing is that that transnormative discourse does that unless you like come out and tell everybody and reveal who you are, you're not being your authentic self. And that's based on those sort of normative discourses. So that's another part of looking at transnormativity. There's a lot of scholars who are doing that. And also like some really cool articles I've been recently reading where young trans folks really complicating all what we're talking about and are using YouTube as a site of contesting transnormativity.
Yeah, and that has me thinking about how as narrative practitioners, we are already interested in questioning notions of authentic self, and that we're well positioned to be able to hold space for multitudes of possibilities and fluidity of identity across people's lives, and also honoring if someone feels like the staticness of their identity in a particular moment is really important and life-saving, being able to do those two things at the same time.
Definitely.
I'm wondering, I'm imagining that there's some questions that you get asked about your work all the time, some of which you might enjoy, some of which might get a little boring. Are there any questions that you really wish you got asked about your work?
Yeah, they're the questions you asked. So just look at the interview, because that's like, those are the questions that are not often asked. It's more like the questions that I often get asked are like kind of that, again, well-meaning, right? Like, you know, social workers and therapists, narrative therapists, we really see ourselves as like good people and well-meaning, which can be problematic because it lead to some areas where you don't have that awareness of where you're reproducing normativity or some forms of microaggression. So like sometimes the curiosity would be more about, how do you know if somebody's really trans? Like, what if you write a letter and they, you know, regret it? You know, sort of like the more expert questions, in wanting me to, like, what do trans, like asking me, what do trans people really feel about this? I'm like, I mean, first of all, trans is like, there's no universal trans experience. And why are you asking me this question? The question more is like, how do I situate myself as a cis person, as a co-conspirator to help folks, trans folks, access their preferred journey, their own, not the authentic self, but their preferred journey that's ongoing. What role do I play in that? Those questions probably don't get asked as much. So like in my field, right, social work as a professor, often it'll be like, I don't know much about that population, you know, that discourse and diversity. So somebody wants to do their practicum or their internship at the Gender Health Center, and I'll ask them, well, why do you want, because I don't know anything about the trans community, which is on one hand, okay, that makes sense, but it's still learning often at the expense. It's like, I have this experience and get this credential that I'm affirming, but it doesn't really look at my own privilege and how I might be reproducing some of the same problems that I'm trying to address. So a lot of it, I wish people would ask me about, like, you know, where do I see my role as a cis person that amplifies the voices of trans folks? That's what the book's trying to look at. How, maybe questions about how has this impacted the way I work narratively? Has it shifted the way I work narratively? Maybe how it's affected my personal life. It might include like, how do I do this work not in the micro aspect of therapy, but more in community work? How do I help I'm a therapist, but I see myself more as like doing community work. I like a macro activist doing like micro work, but I think, I think there needs to be more conversations and asking me like, well, what can I do as a cis person, as a therapist, as a social worker to change our health policies, or some of the policies that Trump put into office. Like, so I think I don't get asked enough about the larger macro picture. Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to have to make another time so I can continue asking you all of those questions. But well, thanks so much, David, and take care. Look after yourself out there.
Yeah. Okay. Take care.